have that amount of time, but you don't necessarily have to spend all that amount of time. I know the way that Lynn's classes run, and there's a lot of student input. So I'm happy to be here to help in any way, to add to the class or your knowledge, and I'm also happy to stop talking when the time comes. But I'd also like to have it be very, very interactive. I think it's that's the way everybody learns the most. Len, when he asked me to drop by, he asked me to talk a little bit about Steve Jobs, and and let me start out by asking a couple of really silly questions. How many people know who Steve Jobs was? Okay, I mean that's a very silly question, but in some ways it's an interesting one. How many people have or have used an iPod? Okay, how many people have or have used an iPhone? An iPad? Okay, how many people have seen the movie either Toy Story 1, 2, or 3? And how many people have used an Apple iTV? Yeah? So one of the interesting things about Steve Jobs is that he really was a huge innovator. And also, let me just say at the beginning, a kind of a disclaimer. I was fortunate to have met Steve in the very early days of the personal computer industry. And our companies worked together a lot at the very beginning. And we had some conversations at that point. My partners knew him very well. I knew him, a bit less well, but we had several interactions, and the companies worked very close together. I don't want to represent myself as the expert on Steve Jobs or whatever. I hadn't seen him in a long time before he died. I was very sad to hear that he died and that he was having health problems. He was, in many ways, an amazing guy, but I don't want to represent myself, to be the world expert on Steve Jobs, which I am not in any way. But the interesting thing to me, particularly for our purposes in class, is that he was a very exciting, very charismatic, very pivotal person in the development not only of the personal computer industry, but really in 4 industries so far. And that's unusual for somebody to say about most people. And I think it would be very useful to think about his leadership style. I asked Len to ask you a couple of questions about that in preparation, about his leadership style, about what made him unique, sort of the strengths and weaknesses and all that sort of thing. And also think about the future, sort of going forward. There are a couple of things that occur to me. One of my business partners in the VisiCalc venture, the first spreadsheet venture, said something a long time ago to me, and that's one thing I would just offer everyone. If you're really lucky in life, you'll run into some people early on who will become great friends and throughout your whole life. And I was very fortunate that way, that the people that I worked with, my business partners in software arts, the VisiCalc venture, we became very close friends. We are still very good friends. Our families are very friendly, and we see each other a good bit. We've gone through a whole bunch of happy events together and some sad events that happened, as time goes on in families as well, births, deaths, and so forth. So we were very, very lucky. But one of the things one of my partners said that I thought was really interesting in terms of putting things in perspective is that he said, a genius is someone who you don't know. And if you think about that for a little bit, it's not to take away from anybody who, like Steve Jobs or someone else, certainly not take away from him. If somebody really is hugely innovative and a terrific leader in many ways. But the interesting thing is that when you get to know people, and I'm sure you have all had that phenomenon, they have the side of them that are people. They're real people. They're not an icon in their personal life. You know, somebody may think you're an icon, and then you go home and someone says, you know, take out the trash, will you? And you say, yeah, sorry about that. You know, so, and I think that doesn't diminish a person, it only makes them more real. So I think one of the things that is very, you know, I think would be useful for us to talk about is, you know, what about, you know, maybe start with a question. How many people think that Steve Jobs was a good leader? And hold your hands high, so it doesn't cost anything to vote. There's no charge. Lynn said I could not charge. Usually I charge for voting, but how many people think he wasn't a good leader? Okay, so we have a half vote. Okay, so we can. Why do you think he was a good leader? What are the traits that he had that for the people who said he was a good leader? Yes, and why don't we try to write some. Can I get the screen up? Just
IT.
maybe some lights here.
Sorry, Julie, not allowed to use that.
Oh, okay, sorry. I got carried away here. It's a blank.
Yeah, union people do that.
Thank you. The problem with a professor, you give a professor some chalk and they write stuff. It's terrible. But so what are some of the traits we had? Yeah.
I think he was a visionary. He knew where you want to take the company to.
Okay, he had vision. Okay. What else? Yes.
Along with himself being a great inventor, he also allowed all the employees to kind of have some kind of entrepreneurial ideas to products and kind of innovate in the company.
Okay, so he sort of fostered innovation, people by the team. Yes.
Actual physical aspect. So he was the face of a company. He could represent not only the company, but his, I guess, target audience too.
Okay. Is that always a good thing if you have someone who's the face of the company?
Not necessarily, but for this, I mean, for how innovative they were, and for how far they wanted to reach, somebody had to step up and say, yes, we will do this, and it will be done.
And one of the downsides is what happens when the person leaves or dies in a case like that. Or what about the value of the company? Yeah.
He had such strong passion for his vision that he was able to inspire the people around him. It's like a combination of his
So he
vision
had
and
passion. And is that important?
very.
Was his passion genuine or put on?
I think it was genuine.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing about passion. I always say to people, passion is really important, but in some ways it becomes a cliche. Everyone says, oh, we got passion. And sometimes, have you ever seen somebody who's given a speech and say, passion is really important? You know, and you got to really have it. Yeah.
Well, our team did a bit of research before coming to class. One of the things we found was a guy named Simon Sinek. He's come to Babson before. Motivational speaker, talks a lot about Apple, what a great company it is.
Yeah.
And one of the things he says is Apple understands why they do what they do. They don't understand just what. The what would be, you know, to make a profit or to build MP3 players. But Apple understands and their employees understand they're doing this because they want to provide people with, you know, 1,000 songs in the palm of their hand and different things like that. And that just shows through in the brand.
And how do they do that? How does Steve Jobs or someone get people to understand? Does every company, your people understand why they do what they do?
No, I think him being a strong leader and empowering them really, you know, they understood why they got out of bed every morning, you know, and they were passionate.
Why they came to work?
Exactly.
They want to know that.
I think the biggest ability he put out there was and he said empowering people with the risk-taking ability. He let people make decisions. He
Okay.
drove the company to go forward.
So encourage people to make decisions. Is that risky? Supposing they make bad decisions.
It is risky, but I think that if done it the right way, as Steve Jobs did, it would work wonders.
He was a master of shaping culture.
Okay, shaping culture, can you give me an example?
So in the early days, creating culture around the Mac brand and the Mac team and what that meant from a design, hard work standpoint, all that kind of stuff.
And you mentioned design. Did you hear about design?
Immensely. It was everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think going along with the religion and the passion, these are all perceptions that we have from somebody that we don't actually know. And this is what we have come to be told about him, but none of us really know him. And from things that I've read and movies I've seen about him, it also shows that he was not a great leader in a way that he once almost brought the company to destruction because he brought groups inside the company to fight against each other to produce the best product. So in that obsession of him of making everything so passionate and so religion, he even destroyed the whole harmony of the company. I don't know if you agree or disagree. Or
Well, again, it's interesting, and I think, again, all of these points are really important. I mean, there are pluses and negatives, and there are all kinds of people saying things. One of the things that you'll see will happen, of course, his death was so recent that, people are having, first you see the first reactions and the second, and then it's going to take a while. But people are going to probably be writing about him for years and years. And one of the things you see about history, I happen to enjoy reading about history because you learn. There's an old saying, if you don't read history, you're condemned to make the same mistakes again and again. And if you look at the presidents of the United States, for example, or any country, but I'm thinking of the United States, there was all sorts of revision about their style, about whether they were great, whether they weren't great. So you take people like Teddy Roosevelt. There was someone I just read about who just died. I didn't know anything about him, but I happened to read, he was in some local newspaper. He was a professor of history, and they said that before he started writing about Teddy Roosevelt, people thought that Teddy Roosevelt wasn't a very effective president, that he yelled loud, but he wasn't, he didn't have, much intelligence or charisma. This guy did a lot of research on him and sort of changed a whole bunch of people's views about Teddy Roosevelt, saying he really was innovative, he was charismatic, he did a whole bunch of things. Harry Truman was a president right after the Second World War. A lot of people at that time apparently thought that he was a terrible president. He was a political hack. People have looked more into what he did, thought about it, and they sort of changed their minds. And you can take that through Eisenhower, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and then the closer you get to people, the more people, have a variety of opinions. So with Steve Jobs, this idea of, what about that management style? He was hugely demanding.
in Pirates of Silicon Valley, they portray him as a bad leader.
Well, again, and the interesting thing also about a lot of these books, the one bit of insight that I might give you about some of that, having been in some of these places some of the time, is that, again, what is written by a person or by a group, and that is their particular view and their particular perception of the person they're writing about, who they may understand and who they may not understand. One thing about Steve Jobs that I think was probably true, and again, in talking about that, I hesitate to say anything about Steve Jobs because I met him, our companies worked together, but I am no expert, I wasn't a close friend or anything like that, but in terms of what you view is that he was a very private person, that a lot of the stuff that's coming out now in the various books is hugely unusual, that he kept his private life totally separate, and he was hugely successful in doing that. So different people will look at different aspects of a whole variety of people, and they will tell you all kinds of stories about them. But in fact, they may know, they may not know. And it reminds me of the old story they said, you have a bunch of blind people who are examining an elephant. And they say, well, what do you see? Well, somebody is at the tusk, so they think an elephant looks a particular way, and they're, this big leg, or a trunk, or something else. And they all have a different view of what the elephant is, because they're only seeing a certain part of it. So again, we're not trying to do any kind of definitive analysis of Steve Jobs, but what we're looking at is an example of somebody who has been hugely successful, and look at how do you replicate that? What worked, what didn't work, what makes sense, what doesn't.
I think the main thing is that he recognized when he wasn't fit to lead the company and stepped down. So there were several times during when his cancer was at its worst where he made the decision to step down because he wasn't as effective at running the company, and he hindered the development. And also when he finally said that last time, the email that he sent out, so that if there ever came a time that he was unfit to lead the company, he would make the decision. So that takes, I think, a lot of courage and intelligence to say that even though this is my company, I realize that because of my illness, I'm not going to be able to run it the way that it should be run.
So you need courage, you need intelligence, you need the real signal. You need to understand what's real and what isn't. And it's very hard to get perspective inside the company as well as people outside the company, looking in. Yes.
Another one to add on this is our initiative, because his partner, Steve Wozniak, was the actual kind of brains behind the tech part of Apple. He was more just, he had more of a passion just for to build things, he never saw the kind of bigger meaning or bigger picture that could be associated with, PCs as opposed to just building it. And Steve Jobs kind of pushed him and pushed everyone around him to kind of take the initiative to start the company.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. They back in the early '80s, maybe it was getting to be the mid '80s. Time magazine has a Person of the Year. I don't know if you've seen those, and they decided apparently to make Steve Jobs the Person of the Year. It might have been 1983 or 1984, somewhere around there. And when you read the story, that's exactly, it was all about Steve and about Apple. But the word was that at some point they decided, well, wait a minute, we're singling out one computer company, and there are a whole bunch of computer companies. And I don't know whether they actually looked at that or not, but a lot of their advertising came from computer companies, and people could disagree as who was most important. So they turned it into the Machine of the Year. It's the only time they've ever had a Machine of the Year. But the story was about essentially Apple and Steve Jobs. And when they were writing the story, they were trying to be balanced. So, or you could tell that as you read the story. And so they were saying a lot of positive things about Apple and Steve Jobs. But at some point, they went to Steve Wozniak and they said to Woz, is it true that Steve Jobs really doesn't know a whole lot about technology? He's not an engineer, because they're looking for kind of a downside. Yes, he's great at sales and he's vision, but he doesn't understand, the technology. So Woz said something, at least in Time magazine, and I've seen him say it since, that he said, well, yeah, that's true. Actually, there isn't one circuit in the Apple II that he designed. But on the other hand, he was the one who thought we ought to sell the computer. And when you think about that, it's unusual to have somebody who is the head of a technology company who doesn't have a technology background, or at least it was in those days, and it still is today. But you can mention a whole variety of people, or more and more these days, who had the vision, had the leadership skills, and figured out how to, how to do things like that. Just as a slight digression, but an example, I have a very good friend on the faculty who I teach with, a fellow named Craig Benson, who some of you may have seen. He's a Babson alumnus. He's now the vice chair of the trustees. He's a terrific guy. He and I teach several courses together. And he was the co-founder of a technology company, one of the early networking companies called Cabletron. Huge success. And eventually he went on, he wanted to give back to the world, and he became governor of New Hampshire, as well as doing a variety of other things. And Craig actually was not a technologist. He wasn't an engineer. He was a Babson undergraduate. He was an expert in finance and operations. His partner, Bob Levine, was hugely great in sales and marketing, but yet their success was in technology, one of the most successful networking companies. So you can have, and when you go back to Steve Jobs, it's a similar example, that most of the people in Silicon Valley were into technology. He wasn't. He certainly ended up knowing a lot about technology. He has a whole bunch of patents to his name and whatever. But his, as you're pointing out, his genius, or part of it, was knowing, you know, how to put the package together and knowing how to motivate people.
I sit here sometimes, people say to me, you know, what's an entrepreneur and or what's a successful entrepreneur? And I say to them, well, find a problem to solve, okay, or do it quicker, faster, cheaper, more efficiently, or creative. But I almost think that as I go through Steve Jobs, he was even greater than that in the sense that he created a desire in us to have a product that we didn't even know was there, Julian, and that is so rare.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I absolutely agree, and I absolutely say that to people. He was in many ways highly unusual. There are very few people I've met in my life, and there are very few people that I've observed, who in a way knew what the customer wanted before the customer knew what they wanted. And that's sort of a unique skill. Somebody asked him about, I don't know whether it was the iPad or whatever, so, you know, well, did you have focus groups? You know, how did you do this? And he said, no, because people didn't know they wanted it. You know, he knew what the people wanted, and his team did. So I think, Len, I think that's an absolutely great point, that he was able to anticipate what people wanted, partly because it's what he wanted. It's what he wanted to do, and he was very much in tune with the user, with what the user wanted to do. Yes?
I think that's definitely a skill, but I'm not sure that's something that contributes to his leadership, because there's kind of two senses of the way a company can go. Like, you can either be a leader who, like, for example, like tells the time, or someone who builds a clock. And like, he was very good at coming up with gut instincts and knowing what people wanted and telling the time and being able to lead with that. But he couldn't transfer that to the people around him in the same sense, because it's a gut instinct. It's not something that you can teach people in like building the clock of the company in order to actually keep going forward. So I think that's a skill, but not necessarily contributes to his leadership.
Well, well, that's a very interesting point.
I would completely actually disagree to that comment, simply because he was the first, it is the first tech company that when they had a board of directors meeting, they had someone on the design team to be on the board of directors. Microsoft still doesn't do that. And although he wasn't a leader in a traditional sense, but the vision that he had, his whole passion was to make Apple a success. And everything that he did was towards that. So although he didn't do directly, although he didn't know the mechanics of it, he made sure he brought the right people onto the team so they could create, perfect every last one of the company, from retail stores to the culture of the company and the tech part as well.
What she was saying wasn't so much about that. She was saying that he brings people on that are experts in those areas, but he doesn't have somebody like Tim Cook's not the same
The gut
visionary.
instinct.
He's not going to see the next iPad, and that's evident when he gives his keynote address. And it's completely different than the way that Jobs presents on stage, because he's like a doer and not a thinker. And that's the big difference between them, is that he might have experts in each area, but I think what
Transferring
Marlene was
gut
talking
instinct
about,
and passion is different than transferring technical skills.
for seeing the next big thing. You might have somebody on there that's going to make the iPad the best tablet, but to think of the iPad in general and then to find the right people. There's that step two, is finding the right people, but thinking of that idea that no one knows why they even need that, that's what.
Just wait for the product.
Okay, so you say it's a difference between transferring actual knowledge where you can make a clock to what the time is. He's still transferring something. He's still delivering something. Maybe it's an intangible, but he's still delivering something. And second off, how can you bring someone down for not being able to pass on something he's great at? Maybe that's why he's such a great leader, because people can't follow him. I mean, follow him in succession. Like, he's too good to come next. Like, who's next? Some guy that can't do his job? Yeah, maybe because that's why he's such a good leader.
Professor, you asked us why we thought he was a leader. May I ask you why you think he was a leader?
Welcome to my class.
Because you all think he is. No, I'm happy to give you an answer, but I'd like to get a couple of more comments first before I do it. I don't want to close off discussion because I don't claim to have all the answers as to what I think.
Talking of what Len said, I think a great quality of his, he was rebellious. He didn't stick to the norm, so he changed the pattern of how things were done. And in fact, I read an article recently, this is rebellious in a negative way, but he went against his doctor's orders on what they suggested for curing the cancer. And he debated, thinking that, oh, I can find my own cure, and that made the whole situation worse than he could fix it.
And in some ways, that was very much the way he did a lot of things. That it was part of his passion.
Did you personally experience that at all, the rebellion, when working with him, that he was rebellious, he wanted to change the way it's done?
Well, it's interesting. Again, as I say, there are all kinds of experts now. I mean, people are coming out and saying that, my brother-in-law's sister-in-law was, a person who took the same train that Steve Jobs took in 1980, or that he may have taken in that station, and may have run into someone and gone through the same turnstile that they did, maybe. So you have all these people now, and therefore they're an expert on Steve Jobs. So I don't mean to want to say that, but one interesting thing, and again, just a few times.
Just a few more than.
Yeah, okay, then I'll respond to that, yes.
I think something that really interests me about his leadership style is, when he left Apple to Scully and he created Next, the phase that he went through those 6 months, I was watching this in his documentary, he said that, his whole aim of not creating just hardware, but improving the life of the technology.
Yeah.
And that's when he created the next Apple, and then the software development, and how he recruited people. That process, I think, was the one that really changed his leadership style. Because earlier he was not reluctant to take risks at all. He did not see what consequences would come forth. But after he was kicked out of Apple, he realized what consequences could come out of as a result of his risks. And he got more down-prone to taking risks. And that was one of the reasons why he started thinking not 100 years ahead, but 10 years ahead.
Now, is taking risk important for a leader? Do you think? I think this person took one risk too many. But do you think that's important, taking risks? We have a couple more, Alex.
Just to the point earlier, I don't really see why not having a certain technical knowledge will hinder you from that gut instinct of figuring out the next big anything. Because as long as you have the ideas, as long as you have the vision for anything, if you can box it into an idea, if you can say, I want people to be able to carry music in their pockets. That idea is what brings to life technology. Technology is brought to life through ideas, and yes, you need the technology, but people out there know the technology.
What was innovative, truly innovative about the iPod? I mean, certainly it was this tiny thing that you could put in your pocket or whatever, but was that the only thing? What else did you have to do to make that work?
The clicker. I know that the MP3 and things like that had the music in it for a long period of time. But I was reading an article where they said that the thing that worked the most with the clicker, so when you move the dial around, the clicking sound is what really customers adapted to really quickly.
And again, part of that theme of understanding what the customers want, but there were some other things happening too. And then
The design, which was not only in terms of the attractiveness of the product, but in terms of the way it worked, the way you were able to sync tracks from iTunes, which is another Apple product.
Yeah.
The way they created the system, that was what actually sold the market.
Yeah, Albert.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, that the way in which he created the whole store in iTunes, and the way that he integrated the whole systems so seamless. It made it so easy for the user, because he was not the first to do a tablet, he was not the first to do a phone, he was not the first to do an MP3 player, but he was the first one to do it well.
Yeah, it was putting it all together. But there was another aspect too. If you have an iPod, why do you have an iPod? What do you do with an iPod? I mean, the original iPod. Listen to music, right? And you have, thousands of songs that you can listen to. What do you need? We're talking about the technology and design, all of which is hugely important. But what else do you need to make an iPod work?
Is it the white headphones?
You need the head, absolutely. Again, that's another technical thing, and absolutely you need that.
You need to be able to see other people that do the same thing, so you create a whole community.
It's sort of viral,
and a
and you
lifestyle.
absolutely need that. Yes,
You needed a computer and the software so you could play music on the iPod.
yeah.
So you had to buy more products.
And again, and again, the other thing you're putting, your finger on is you need the music. You need the content. You had this wonderful stuff. There's an MP3, standard, and there's all this kind of stuff. Although there was a lot of controversy back then. I'm sure none of you remember that controversy. You probably were thinking about those things 10 years ago. But there was a lot of controversy, and some people are coming backing up the vinyl, what they call records. I don't know if you've heard of the records, but they're things that spin or whatever, CDs, long ago. That's cavemen and women used to use those things. But some people say it has a mellower sound, so they'll get the old turntables or whatever. So people were criticizing them for MP3. So there were, technical things. But what the key piece was, you needed the content. And in order to have the content, you had to have a new business model. I had a number of students who thought of, in the late 90s, both undergraduates and graduates, who I'm teaching courses then that had business plans in them, and the overall, I don't know whether they call it 3501 now or 7500, and we'd have teams and they come up with ideas, and people were coming up with these ideas, and they said it would be great if we could design something, which again they hadn't designed, but use these MP3 files and get the music content. But one of the huge stumbling blocks was you had to convince the artists and the music companies to put their stuff on. And again, I don't expect you to know this, but does anyone have an idea as to why there was resistance on the part of the artists and the music companies? Yes.
Well, I don't know. I remember Billy Joel had a quote that the MP3 was the destruction of music because it dampened all the sound, they cut all the nuance out, so the music, as it was originally created, wasn't accurately represented by the MP3.
Yeah, and again, that is a technical reason, and it's true, except when you get everybody listening to it, and they've also made it technically better than it used to be, but they sort of would cut off the extremes of the, what they call overtones in music, and that's what makes it sound rich when you have the extra vibration. But that was a technical reason, but what I'm thinking about more is a business reason. Yes.
They're probably not going to get their CD sales or the amount of money that they would regularly, and plus with iTunes you can pick specific songs, so you don't have to purchase the record entirely. You can just pick one song from
that. That was the huge problem, because the old business model was you'd have somebody have a hit, and everybody would play it on the radio. You guys ever hear of radios? They used to have radios, and people would play it on radios for free, and then the only way you could get that, occasionally they'd release a single, but most of the time you'd have to buy this whole album for $15 or $10 or whatever, and you'd have 10 songs that nobody cared about, it goes back to the real old models. I mean, in the 60s, and 50s, and 70s, where they would release singles. They had something called 45 on RPM. You'll see it in the museum sometime, dusty, with this little record with a big hole in the middle of it. And again, the quality wasn't very high, but they were cheap to produce. And somebody would record, an artist would record a song on one side, and that would be the hit. And the flip side was usually some throwaway that nobody was interested in. So they'd only play one side. But then the record companies, the music companies, expanded the model so they could sell albums for a much higher markup for a whole bunch of songs that you didn't want in order to get the one that you wanted. Now, what Steve Jobs was saying was, went to the record companies and the artists, by the way, I want you to sell these songs individually. So if somebody only likes one song in the album, they're gonna buy it. And I also want you to sell them for 99 cents as opposed to $10. Now, why wouldn't the music companies be interested in that deal? Isn't that such a deal, right? A great deal. No? Tyler?
Because they're used to getting $10 for the value of one hit and a bunch of crap, and now they only get 99 cents.
And in fact, they can, because it wasn't necessarily collusion. They all kind of did it tacitly. That was the model. That's what everybody followed. Were the artists opposed to that? Did the artists come out and say, no, I want you to sell only one of these songs and for 99 cents, and I want the royalties from the 99 cents. I don't want you to sell these others that people aren't interested in. Did the artists say that? No, they wanted the money too. Okay?
We've learned this concept that he created a blue ocean, which is like he combined two industries and went to a new industry that had no competitors.
So, how did Jobs get the music companies, do you think, to agree to this, which seemed to be totally against their model? What was it in the system that they couldn't control that he played off? Yeah.
Well, I mean, wouldn't now that they have the iTunes store, that just increases their exposure? So even though they're selling things at a lower price, they're getting more people to buy it.
But you'd have to sell a lot more, but that's part of it. That's part of it. What else was happening there?
Well, couldn't you just have scared the labels and said, like, look, one day all these kids can just download the album for free anyway, so why not make like a couple of bucks here and not make anything at all?
Yeah, there was something called piracy. You probably haven't heard of that. But people would take things off the internet for free. And basically, the music companies were losing billions of dollars. So what he did was go to them and say, look, you are, just as you're saying, you're losing billions of dollars. Maybe you'll only make 99 cents, but if you give people a path to do something that is legal, most people will do it. Most people are not breaking the law just for fun. They're doing it because the pricing system seems so out of whack. So he gave them, he found out what they needed. He was also very charismatic, very well positioned to have Apple lead it. He knew a lot of the artists and convinced some of them, to come actually make commercials for him. And he demonstrated that it could work. So is that leadership? I would think so. It's a certain kind of leadership that you've got to negotiate, you've got to get people together. But he also had a passion and had a real feeling that this was all going to work. Now, given that the time, this is a great discussion, this is a great group. This is really a terrific group. I want, before we finish up, to go on to the future, because again, we had a little discussion before. I thought it was a very interesting discussion. What about succession in a company when you have a great leader? Sometimes the greater the leader, the more difficult the succession. And leaders don't live forever, even if it's very, very sad when they die. But even if they don't die, they eventually move on and do some other things. So, what do you think is going to happen with Apple going forward? And what would you do if you were on Apple's board now, and you were, or you were the CEO going forward? You've got a great franchise. You have one of the most valuable companies in the world. So you have huge resources. But what would you do to keep this up? Yes, Dave.
Well, after doing some research, we know that a lot of things we know about Apple comes from rumors. There's so many rumors, and coming to September, some of these rumors are always true, some aren't. So some of the things
it's a great thing about rumors. It keeps people guessing all the time.
Yeah. So when I spoke to a couple of friends who are software designers, they told me that apparently when Steve felt he's going downhill, and he had a lot of ideas that he kept to himself along with his private life, he spilled out all these ideas to Tim Cook and tried to give as much of what was on his head to run the company for the estimate around 10 years with full of ideas. So he tried to give all his knowledge out.
So there is knowledge, there's content, but aren't we also saying there's something more that you need to implement it as well? Eric and then Preston?
Yeah, I just think they're going to have to slow down their releases of their new innovations, and they're probably going to have to
Why? Why do they need slow down?
Cycle speeding up.
Because they don't have that visionary they used to have. So that in their process of finding a new person to be that vision, because from what I've read, Steve Jobs always was telling Tim Cook, don't try and think like, what would Steve Jobs do in this situation? He was always telling him, find someone who has a vision.
Well, and I actually heard it in a slightly different way, not from him, so I'm not sure this is right either. But that a lot of people are saying, well, what would Steve do? And that actually happens with all sorts of companies, and particularly after a person's gone. You have, it's true in families sometimes. People, there'll be a father or a mother or grandfather or grandmother who is at the head of the family and kind of keeps everyone in line. And then after that person goes, in some families, some things can get fragmented, and people will say, well, no, Mom would have done this. Mom would never have done that. Oh, Dad would have done this. And how do you know? So a lot of people are kind of saying, what would Steve do? And what I read, I don't know if he actually said it, but it sounds like something that he might have said, is that don't concentrate on what I would have done. Do what's right. And in a way, it's almost, and what's right, of course, depends upon people's point of view and a whole right, but he was basically saying, search for the right answer. It's like a case discussion. There's no right answer to this discussion or particular question, but it's thinking, it's figuring out what the process will be. Sort of like Mark Twain, the famous humorist, said, always do right. It'll gratify some people and amaze everybody else. Try to do the right thing.
I think the difficulty with Tim Cook is that his claim to fame is inventory management, which is a pretty, boring area. So
is it an important area?
It's a very important area for Apple, and that's why.
They got 300,000, 700,000 people working for them in China and 30,000 engineers. You better have somebody.
Yeah, and that's why I think got into that position, but it'll be difficult because I think ideally you'd like to slow down the innovation process, but it's actually inverse right now. The process of software releases and hardware releases is speeding up every year. So that's going to be a difficult hurdle for Apple to overcome.
Do you think anybody could follow a leader like Steve Jobs? And be thought of in the same way?
I think that was the downfall to his leadership, is that there's no way he could have found someone that could lead the way he did. And then you have to ask the question, is finding a successor, is that part of being a good leader?
Well, that certainly, succession is certainly part of it. But let's say a person is highly unique. So the two alternatives are, don't have that person ever become the CEO because it'll be so hard to replace him or her, it'll hurt the company value. Or else, let's get him for as long as we can get him and we'll worry later. So which is better?
Well, why have another Steve Jobs? The whole point of Steve Jobs and the idea he created was him being Apple, right? So have somebody else who can form their own unique identity. No one, and if they manage to do that with another person, you have something else, a fresh start almost.
And I think that's important, Yuvraj, that not only will they have their own unique identity, but Steve Jobs had a variety of things with him that came positionally at a particular point in time. He was the co-founder, and he and Woz were the co-founders, and they actually complemented each other, very much in the early days. I remember I only met Woz a couple of times, and I remember one time they had something they used to call an Apple Fest. It was to promote Apple products, and they had one in Boston. So both Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were coming around, and I had met Steve Jobs a couple of times before that. I never met Woz. And they were very much night owls, so they were going around to various restaurants. Our company was in Central Square in Cambridge at that time. And we used to have, in those days, the pronunciation is different. That instead of Beijing, they used to call it Peking, which was, which the Chinese apparently never called it, but they, that was an English translation that people used here. And I don't know if anyone has ever had Beijing ravioli or, whatever, these dumplings, essentially. They call them, in those days, they call it Peking ravioli. So we would have Peking ravioli hunts. There were a lot of Asian restaurants in Central Square, so we would, just shows you what programmers do for diversion. And we would go around a bunch of different restaurants and try to find who has the best ravioli. And so they apparently were doing that. And so Woz came to our company. He was going to come to our company late. But at that time, my wife and I just had one child. We now have three. We're all grown up. But our daughter was very young, and I used to like to go home and have dinner. And if I needed to come back to work, I would. But I wanted to spend time with the family. So I said, look, I'm going home. I told my partners, and call me about a half hour before you think Woz is going to get here. So they called me at about midnight and said, we think he's coming in the next hour or two. I said, okay. So I got in my car, came back, and I met Woz. And he was a very interesting, and Steve Jobs did not come that particular time. But Woz was a very interesting compliment, And I remember we were trying to do something really nice for him, so we showed him around the company, and we had just gotten these T-shirts made, and that had, our busy calc and the spreadsheet, the little T in the spreadsheet, and the columns and rows, and we gave him a T-shirt, and he put it on, and he said, where's the pocket for my pen, So that's how our T-shirts got pockets. We had specially made, for them. But they were very, in the early days, it was a very small industry, and that's the kind of thing where you got to know some people well, or at least they weren't caricature figures. Later on, they all became hugely famous, and you think about how can you replace that person. Well, you can never get somebody who's going to be the founder of the company again. So you have to go to the next stage. Bill Gates, followed a very different model as to how his company, developed. So, but I think the key question is, what do you think is going to happen to Apple over time? What do you think is going to happen to their, if they have to slow down their innovation, when innovation is actually speeding up, what do you think is going to happen to their stock price and their capitalization?
Well, going apart from the stock price and the market cap, I was thinking, if they do slow down, I think one of the biggest reserves they have is their cash reserves. And that'll maybe lead to a lot of maybe acquisitions and maybe something along those lines.
Yeah.
Because I believe that when Steve Jobs heard about his illness, that's when they started getting all those cash reserves. Maybe go ahead when he's not around to kind of go ahead and accelerate the company through maybe acquisitions of different companies.
If you were on the board, what would you think your most important job would be at this point in time? If you were on Apple's board.
Make sure the vision and the culture of Apple.
Because the culture is one of the ways that you get a company to continue to have that